He never wrote a single line of code. He was fired from his own company. And yet, this man changed technology forever. Steve Jobs didn't just build Apple. He weaponized a philosophy so powerful it bent reality itself. This is the mind that made the impossible inevitable. Steve Jobs, the co-founder of Apple, the mastermind behind the iPhone, and the architect of the modern digital age. But beneath the product launches and billion-dollar valuations lies something far more profound, a unique philosophy about life, work, and human potential that guided every decision he made. Today we're not just looking at his products, but at his core beliefs, his obsession with simplicity, his relentless pursuit of perfection, and his unwavering faith in the power of following your passion. These aren't just business principles, they're life philosophies that can transform how you think about success, creativity, and purpose. Born in 1955 in San Francisco, Steve Jobs' story began with abandonment and adoption, experiences that would shape his lifelong search for meaning and belonging. Adopted by Paul and Clara Jobs, a working-class couple in Mountain View, California, young Steve grew up in the heart of what would become Silicon Valley. His childhood wasn't ordinary. This was a kid who stuck pins into electrical sockets and ate poison, twice requiring emergency room visits. But it was also a childhood of curiosity and rebellion. At 13, he met Steve Wozniak, 5 years his senior but equally mischievous, bonding over electronics and pranks. Their friendship would later birth Apple. Jobs was a college dropout, spending just one semester at Reed College before leaving to audit classes that interested him, like calligraphy, which would later influence Apple's revolutionary typography. He traveled to India seeking spiritual enlightenment, experimented with psychedelic drugs, and immersed himself in Zen Buddhism. These weren't just youthful adventures, they were the foundations of a philosophy that would guide him for life. At 21, working out of his parents' garage, Jobs and Wozniak launched Apple. But success came with its own challenges. In 1985, at just 30 years old, Jobs was fired from his own company, a devastating blow that he later called the best thing that ever happened to him. During his 12-year exile, he founded Next and acquired Pixar, experiences that refined his vision and prepared him for his triumphant return to Apple in 1997. Principle 1. Do what you love. Your work is going to fill a large part of your life, and the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do. This wasn't just career advice for Steve Jobs, it was his North Star, his guiding philosophy, the foundation upon which he built everything. It was the principle that carried him through his greatest triumphs and his darkest moments. When Jobs delivered these words at Stanford University's 2005 commencement address, they weren't the platitudes of a billionaire offering feel-good motivation to graduates. They were hard-won truths born from a life that had tested this philosophy repeatedly, and proven it right every single time. Let's be clear about something. Jobs didn't stumble into loving what he did. His journey wasn't a straight line from childhood passion to billion-dollar empire. It was messy, chaotic, and profoundly unconventional. Born in 1955 and given up for adoption at birth, Jobs spent his early years grappling with questions of identity and belonging, questions that would fuel his lifelong search for meaning and purpose. At Reed College in Portland, Oregon, Jobs made a decision that would horrify most parents. He dropped out after just one semester. But here's where the story gets interesting. He didn't leave campus. Instead, he stayed around for another 18 months, sleeping on friends' floors, returning Coke bottles for the 5-cent deposits to buy food, and walking 7 miles every Sunday night to get one good meal a week at the local Hare Krishna temple. Why? Because dropping out freed him to stop taking the required classes and start auditing the ones that actually interested him. One of those classes was calligraphy, taught by the renowned calligrapher Robert Palladino. Jobs was mesmerized by the beautiful artistic posters around campus advertising various events. The fonts were so elegant, so carefully crafted, that he had to understand how they were made. In that calligraphy class, he learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, about varying the amount of space between different letter combinations, about what makes great typography great. It was beautiful, historical, artistically subtle in a way that science couldn't capture, and he found it absolutely fascinating. At the time, this seemed completely impractical. There was no obvious career path, no guaranteed return on investment, no way this knowledge would ever pay the bills. But Jobs followed his curiosity anyway, driven by genuine interest rather than pragmatic calculation. A decade later, when he was designing the first Macintosh computer, all of that calligraphy training came flooding back. The Mac became the first computer with beautiful typography, with multiple typefaces and proportionally spaced fonts, features we now take completely for granted. As Jobs later reflected, if he had never dropped in on that single calligraphy course, the Mac would never have had those revolutionary design elements. And since Windows just copied the Mac, it's likely that no personal computer would have them. This is what Jobs meant by loving what you do. It wasn't about finding a pre-packaged passion and following a clear roadmap. It was about having the courage to pursue what genuinely fascinated him, even when it made no practical sense, even when others thought he was wasting his time. When Jobs co-founded Apple at age 21 with his friend Steve Wozniak, working out of his parents' garage, he wasn't driven by dreams of wealth or empire building. He was driven by genuine excitement about what personal computers could become, tools that would empower individuals and democratize access to technology. They worked obsessively, not because they had to, but because they couldn't imagine doing anything else. In just 10 years, Apple grew from 2 guys in a garage to a $2 billion company with over 4,000 employees. They had just released their finest creation, the Macintosh, and Jobs had just turned 30. He was on top of the world. And then everything fell apart. Jobs was fired from Apple, the company he had created. The very board he had helped assemble, led by John Sculley, a CEO Jobs himself had recruited from PepsiCo, voted him out after a bitter power struggle. Jobs was devastated. What had been the focus of his entire adult life was gone. He was publicly humiliated, a failure in the eyes of the very Silicon Valley he had helped build. But here's where Jobs' philosophy about loving your work revealed its true power. In his Stanford speech, Jobs explained, "I'm convinced that the only thing that kept me going was that I loved what I did." He didn't love Apple the company or Apple the brand. He loved the work itself, the process of creating revolutionary products, of pushing boundaries, of making things that had never existed before. And that love was portable. It didn't disappear just because Apple did. During his 12-year exile from Apple, Jobs founded Next, a computer company focused on high-end workstations, and he acquired Pixar, transforming it from a struggling graphics company into the most successful animation studio in history. Were these easy years? Absolutely not. Next struggled commercially. Pixar came close to bankruptcy multiple times. But Jobs kept going, driven not by the need to prove his critics wrong, though that was certainly a factor, but by his genuine love for the creative process itself. Looking back, Jobs called getting fired from Apple the best thing that could have ever happened to him. The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again. He was freed from the weight of expectations, from the organizational politics, from everything except the pure work he loved. This period of struggle refined his vision, deepened his skills, and prepared him for what would become his greatest chapter. When Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, the company was in crisis, losing over $1 billion annually and on the verge of bankruptcy. Jobs immediately demonstrated what loving your work really means. He worked from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. every single day while simultaneously leading Pixar's operations. He developed kidney stones from the stress and workload. But he kept showing up, kept pushing, kept demanding excellence, not out of obligation, but because he genuinely couldn't imagine doing anything else. His love for the work manifested in an almost obsessive attention to detail. When the Macintosh booted up too slowly, he badgered the engineer responsible, treating it as a matter of life or death. He insisted that accessing any function on the iPod should require no more than 3 button presses. He worked with countless artists and advertising agencies to ensure Apple's ads had exactly the right feel, that the imagery and audio synced up perfectly. These weren't the actions of someone grinding through a job. They were the behaviors of someone completely consumed by what they were creating. Jobs believed that when work is driven by genuine passion rather than external motivators like money or recognition, something transformative happens. Passionate people don't just clock in and clock out. They obsess. They iterate endlessly. They push boundaries that others wouldn't even think to question. They're willing to face criticism, endure failure, and persist through obstacles that would cause others to give up, because the work itself is the reward. In his Stanford address, Jobs urged the graduates, "If you haven't found it yet, keep looking. Don't settle. As with all matters of the heart, you'll know when you find it." This wasn't naive optimism. It was hard-won wisdom. Jobs understood that finding work worth loving isn't always immediate or obvious. It requires exploration, experimentation, and the courage to follow curiosity even when the path isn't clear. But there's a nuance here that often gets lost when people quote Jobs' advice about passion. He wasn't suggesting that if you loved something, it would always be easy or joyful. He openly acknowledged that pursuing passion is difficult and comes with immense struggle. What he was saying is that the struggle becomes worthwhile when the work itself matters to you. The long hours, the setbacks, the moments of doubt, they're bearable, even meaningful, when they're in service of something you genuinely care about. When Jobs said, "The only way to do great work is to love what you do," he was making a claim about the nature of excellence itself. Mediocre work, adequate work, good enough work, those things can be achieved through discipline and obligation. But truly great work, the kind that pushes industries forward and changes how people live, that requires something deeper. It requires the kind of relentless commitment that only comes from genuine passion. This is why Jobs' own journey serves as the ultimate proof of his philosophy. From dropping out of college to follow random interests like calligraphy, to building Apple in a garage, to being fired and using that devastation as fuel to create Next and Pixar, to returning to Apple and leading it to become the most valuable company on earth, every chapter of his story demonstrated that loving your work isn't just a nice-to-have. It's the essential ingredient that separates those who leave a lasting impact from those who simply show up. Principle 2. Put a dent in the universe. We're here to put a dent in the universe. Otherwise, why else even be here? Jobs didn't just want to build products. He wanted to change the world. This wasn't hyperbole or marketing speak. It was the core philosophical belief that animated everything he did. His vision for Apple wasn't about making money, capturing market share, or even beating competitors. It was about something far more audacious and almost spiritual, democratizing technology and fundamentally altering how humans interact with information, creativity, and each other. To understand just how radical this philosophy was, consider the computing landscape when Jobs and Steve Wozniak founded Apple in 1976. Computers were massive, room-sized machines operated exclusively by specialists in white lab coats. They were expensive, intimidating, and completely inaccessible to ordinary people. The idea that regular individuals, teachers, artists, small business owners, students, could own and operate their own computers was considered absurd by the computing establishment. But Jobs saw something different. He envisioned a future where technology wasn't locked away in corporate data centers or university research labs. He saw computers as tools for individual empowerment, creativity, and liberation. This wasn't just business ambition. This was messianic thinking. Jobs genuinely believed that putting computers in the hands of ordinary people could democratize access to information and level playing fields in ways that had never been possible before. At the core of Apple's identity was a belief that people with passion can change the world for the better. Jobs wasn't content to merely participate in the technology industry. He wanted to bend reality itself to his vision of what technology could and should become. When Apple introduced the Apple II in 1977, it became one of the first successful mass-produced personal computers. But it was the Macintosh, unveiled in January 1984, that truly embodied Jobs' revolutionary ambitions. At the launch event at the Flint Center in Cupertino, Jobs didn't just introduce a new product. He introduced a fundamentally different way of thinking about human-computer interaction. The Macintosh featured a graphical user interface with icons, windows, and a mouse, elements we now take completely for granted but were revolutionary at the time. Before the Mac, interacting with computers required memorizing complex text commands. You had to know the right syntax, the proper file naming conventions, and dozens of arcane procedures just to accomplish basic tasks. The Mac changed everything by making computing intuitive and visual. You could see files as icons, move them around with a mouse, and interact with the computer in ways that felt natural rather than technical. The New York Times called it revolutionary. But Jobs wasn't satisfied with critical acclaim. He wanted the Mac to fundamentally change the relationship between humans and technology. As journalist Stephen Levy wrote after seeing an early demo, up until that moment, when one said a computer screen lit up, some literary license was required. By the end of the demonstration, I began to understand that these were things a computer should do. Jobs had successfully made people reimagine what was possible. This pattern of reality-bending ambition would repeat throughout Jobs' career. When he introduced the iPod in 2001, he wasn't just launching a music player, he was transforming how humanity experienced and consumed music. The iPod's tagline, 1,000 songs in your pocket, represented more than convenient storage. It represented freedom, freedom from physical media, freedom to carry your entire music collection wherever you went, freedom to curate the soundtrack of your life on the fly. Combined with iTunes, Jobs fundamentally restructured the entire music industry, shifting power from record labels to individual consumers. But perhaps no product better exemplifies Jobs' philosophy of making a dent in the universe than the iPhone. When he took the stage at Macworld on January 9, 2007, Jobs began with a declaration that perfectly captured his ambition. Every once in a while, a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything. He then introduced what he called 3 revolutionary products: a widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communications device. The audience erupted when he revealed they weren't 3 separate devices. They were one device called the iPhone. The iPhone wasn't just a phone. It was a handheld computer more powerful than the desktop machines that had existed just years earlier. It combined communications, entertainment, productivity, and internet access in a single, elegant device with a revolutionary multi-touch interface that required no stylus or physical keyboard. Jobs understood that he wasn't merely creating a better mobile phone. He was fundamentally changing how humans would communicate, access information, capture memories, navigate the world, and even think. And he was right. The iPhone didn't just disrupt the mobile phone industry. It effectively created the smartphone era and transformed virtually every aspect of modern life. It changed photography, navigation, social interaction, commerce, entertainment, education, healthcare, and countless other domains. Time magazine named it the invention of the year. Looking back now, it's almost impossible to imagine contemporary society without smartphones, devices that trace their lineage directly to that 2007 iPhone announcement. When Jobs introduced the iPad in 2010, he positioned it as a third-category device, something between a smartphone and a laptop that would excel at activities like web browsing, email, video watching, music listening, gaming, reading ebooks, and enjoying photos. He demonstrated it not at a desk but while sitting comfortably in a chair, emphasizing that using this thing is remarkable. It's so much more intimate than a laptop. Once again, Jobs wasn't just creating a product category. He was reimagining how technology could integrate into daily life in more natural, human-centered ways. This philosophy of putting a dent in the universe shaped every decision Jobs made. When he returned to Apple in 1997 after his 12-year exile, the company was hemorrhaging over $1 billion annually and on the brink of bankruptcy. Jobs immediately refocused the company on its core mission. He articulated Apple's vision in a single powerful sentence: to make a contribution to the world by making tools for the mind that advance humankind. He killed dozens of product lines that had bloated Apple's portfolio during his absence and realigned everything around what Apple did best, creating revolutionary products that connected with users in profound ways. In a 1985 interview with Playboy, Jobs explained the culture he wanted to create at Apple. People are putting in 18-hour days. We attract a different type of person, a person who doesn't want to wait 5 or 10 years to have someone take a giant risk on him or her. Someone who really wants to get in a little over his head and make a dent in the universe. We are aware that we are doing something significant. We're here at the beginning of it, and we're able to shape how it goes. This wasn't about working long hours for the sake of corporate profits. It was about being part of something that genuinely mattered, about contributing to products and innovations that would outlive everyone involved and genuinely improve human existence. Jobs understood that people are willing to sacrifice, to push themselves beyond what they thought possible, when they believe their work serves a purpose larger than themselves. His wife, Laurene Powell Jobs, later clarified that when people, quote, put a dent in the universe, they often miss the deeper meaning. He was thinking of it as, we are able, each of us, to manipulate the circumstances, she explained to the New York Times. I think about it as looking at the design of the structures and systems that govern our society, and changing those structures. In other words, Jobs wasn't encouraging reckless ambition or ego-driven empire building. He was advocating for the belief that individuals have agency, that through vision, persistence, and excellent execution, it's possible to fundamentally reshape the conditions and systems that define how humanity lives. This philosophy stands in stark contrast to the cautious, incremental approach favored by most corporations. Where others conducted focus groups and market research to discover what customers claimed they wanted, Jobs envisioned products that customers didn't even know were possible. Where others sought to optimize existing paradigms, Jobs sought to obliterate them and create new ones. Where others aimed to capture market share, Jobs aimed to transform entire industries. The results speak for themselves. Apple didn't just become the most valuable company on Earth, it fundamentally altered multiple industries simultaneously. It changed personal computing, music distribution, mobile communications, tablet computing, and even retail with its revolutionary Apple Store concept. These weren't minor improvements or iterative upgrades. They were paradigm shifts that redefined what was possible and what consumers expected. Jobs' philosophy of putting a dent in the universe wasn't about arrogance or delusions of grandeur. It was about recognizing that life is short, that time and energy are limited resources, and that if those resources aren't invested in work that genuinely matters, what's the point? Why settle for mediocrity? Why accept the status quo? Why not dare to imagine that things could be fundamentally different, and then work obsessively to make that vision real? This is what separated Jobs from countless other talented executives and entrepreneurs. He didn't just want to participate in the technology industry. He wanted to fundamentally reshape it. He didn't just want to build successful products. He wanted to create tools that would amplify human potential and permanently alter how civilization functioned. And against all odds, despite being fired from his own company, despite facing countless setbacks and criticisms, he actually succeeded in doing exactly that. Principle 3. Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. That's been one of my mantras. Focus and simplicity. Simple can be harder than complex. You have to work hard to get your thinking clean to make it simple. Jobs' obsession with simplicity went far beyond aesthetics. It wasn't about making things look minimalist or stripping away features to save money. It was something much deeper, a profound philosophical belief that true simplicity could only emerge from understanding complexity so thoroughly that you could distill it down to its absolute essence. This wasn't surface-level simplicity. This was simplicity born from mastery. Jobs often quoted Leonardo da Vinci's maxim, "Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication." This Renaissance ideal became the philosophical foundation for everything Apple created. Like Da Vinci, who sought harmony between form and function in both his art and his inventions, Jobs believed that the most elegant solutions emerged when you understood a problem so deeply that all unnecessary elements simply fell away. To illustrate this philosophy at Apple University, the internal training program Jobs created in 2008 to instill Apple's culture in employees, he used Pablo Picasso's series The Bull. This set of 11 lithographs shows Picasso progressively deconstructing a detailed, realistic drawing of a bull into increasingly simplified forms, ultimately arriving at a few flowing lines that still perfectly capture the essence of the animal. Jobs used this artwork as a teaching tool to explain the creative process, stripping away the unnecessary to reach the essence of a product or idea. It perfectly embodied his belief that it takes a lot of hard work to make something simple, to truly understand the underlying challenges and come up with elegant solutions. The iPod stands as perhaps the most perfect embodiment of this philosophy. When Jobs and his team set out to create a portable music player in 2001, the market was already saturated with MP3 players. But these devices were clunky, confusing, and required reading thick instruction manuals just to perform basic functions. Jobs envisioned something radically different, a device so intuitive that anyone could use it immediately, without instructions. The result was revolutionary. The iPod's interface centered around a single innovation, the click wheel. This circular touch-sensitive control allowed users to scroll through thousands of songs with fluid, intuitive gestures. Moving a finger clockwise scrolled down through the menu, counterclockwise scrolled up. The faster you moved your finger, the faster the scrolling became. For mechanical buttons embedded beneath the wheel's edges, menu, play/pause, forward and back, handled all other functions. The genius wasn't in inventing the wheel. Scroll wheels had existed in mice and other devices for years. The genius was in Phil Schiller's insight that the wheel is the right user interface for this product, combined with the stroke of brillicity that menus should scroll faster the longer the wheel is turned. Jobs didn't create something new from nothing. He took an existing concept, understood its essence, and adapted it perfectly for the specific problem at hand. As he famously said, quoting Picasso, "Good artists copy, great artists steal." The result was stunning in its simplicity, a rectangular device with a screen and a circular controller, with practically no printing on the face, yet control so intuitive that a child could operate it without instruction. There was no learning curve. The iPod reduced the complexity of carrying 1,000 songs in your pocket to a single elegant interface. This wasn't just good design, it was the elimination of design as a barrier between humans and technology. When Jobs introduced the iPhone in 2007, he took this philosophy even further. Existing smartphones were cluttered with physical keyboards, buttons, and interfaces that remained fixed regardless of which application you were using. Jobs saw this as fundamentally wrong. Current phones have keyboards that are there whether you need them or not, and have these control buttons that are fixed in plastic and are the same for every application, he explained at the iPhone's unveiling. The iPhone's revolutionary solution was radical simplicity, a single home button and one large touch screen. No stylus. No physical keyboard. No trackball. Just your finger and a display that could dynamically change based on what you needed in that moment. People were shocked. How could anyone navigate a device with only one button? But Jobs had an answer rooted in his philosophy of simplicity. He personally reviewed every screen of the iPhone's interface, and if he couldn't complete an interaction in 3 intuitive clicks or fewer, he sent his team back to the drawing board. This wasn't arbitrary perfectionism. It was a systematic approach to ensuring that simplicity wasn't just a visual quality but a functional reality. The iPhone capitalized on years of user interface research to make touchscreen interaction more intuitive than anything else on the market. The results transformed the industry. 15 years later, people expect their devices to be easy to use right out of the box. Companies like Samsung mimicked the iPhone's features specifically to simplify their devices for users. Jobs didn't just create a successful product. He reset the baseline for what simplicity in technology should mean. This philosophy extended far beyond product design. When Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, the company was bleeding cash and on the verge of bankruptcy. One of his first actions was to review the company's bloated product lineup. At the time, Apple was selling dozens of different computer models across multiple categories, each with slight variations in specifications and features. Jobs gathered his top managers and asked a simple question: which ones do I tell my friends to buy? When he couldn't get a clear answer, when even Apple's own leadership couldn't explain why so many products were necessary, Jobs made a radical decision. He cut 70% of Apple's product line. The casualties included everything from printers and peripherals to entire computer lines, including the Newton Digital Assistant. Jobs cut all desktop models, there were 15, back to 1. He cut all portable and handheld models back to 1 laptop. He eliminated virtually all manufacturing, moving it offshore. He cut development engineers, software development, distributors, and 5 of the company's 6 national retailers. The new strategy was breathtakingly simple. Apple would produce exactly 4 products organized in a 2x2 matrix. 1 desktop and 1 portable device, each aimed at either consumers or professionals. For professionals, the Power Macintosh G3 desktop and the PowerBook G3 portable. For consumers, the iMac desktop and iBook portable. Everyone thought Apple was doomed. How could a technology company survive with just 4 products? But Jobs understood something profound. Deciding what not to do is as important as deciding what to do, he later explained. It's true for companies, and it's true for products. The move worked spectacularly. During Jobs' first fiscal year after returning, ending in September 1997, Apple lost $1.04 billion and was, in Jobs' words, 90 days from being insolvent. 1 year later, after implementing his radical simplification strategy, the company turned a $309 million profit. With a simpler product line manufactured in Asia, Jobs cut inventory by more than 80%. The focus strategy allowed Apple to pour its resources into making each of those 4 products extraordinary, rather than spreading effort across dozens of mediocre offerings. Jobs explained his approach in a 1998 conversation. The product lineup was too complicated and the company was bleeding cash. A friend of the family asked me which Apple computer she should buy. She couldn't figure out the differences among them, and I couldn't give her clear guidance, either. I was appalled that there was no Apple consumer computer priced under $2,000. This personal frustration, the inability to give simple advice to a family friend, captured the essence of Apple's problem. If their own CEO couldn't clearly explain the product line, how could customers be expected to navigate it? This philosophy of simplicity through elimination extended to every aspect of Apple's operations. Jobs cut virtually all manufacturing. He cut software development. He created a new web store that sold Apple products directly to consumers, cutting out distributors and dealers. Every decision was guided by a single principle: focus on what matters most, and eliminate everything else. Jobs' personal life reflected this same philosophy. Former Apple CEO John Sculley recalled visiting Jobs' house and finding it almost completely empty. He just had a picture of Einstein, whom he admired greatly, and he had a Tiffany lamp and a chair and a bed. He just didn't believe in having lots of things around, but he was incredibly careful in what he selected. This wasn't deprivation. It was intentional curation. By surrounding himself only with things he truly valued, Jobs freed himself from the mental clutter that comes with excessive possessions. The deeper wisdom in Jobs' simplicity philosophy lies in this truth: simple can be harder than complex. You have to work hard to get your thinking clean to make it simple. But it's worth it in the end, because once you get there, you can move mountains. Creating something complex is easy. You just keep adding features, options, and capabilities. Creating something truly simple requires brutal discipline, deep understanding, and the courage to say no repeatedly. Jobs understood that simplicity scales in ways that complexity never can. A simple product is easier to use, easier to explain, easier to manufacture, and easier to support. A simple business strategy is easier to execute, easier to communicate, and easier to maintain. Simplicity isn't about doing less, it's about doing what matters with absolute excellence. This is why Jobs was as proud of what Apple didn't do as what it did. In his worldview, the companies and products that fail aren't those that lack ideas. They're the ones that lack the discipline to focus. They try to be everything to everyone, adding features to please every constituency, until the original vision becomes buried under layers of compromise and complexity. Jobs proved that the opposite approach, ruthless simplification driven by deep understanding, could transform struggling companies into world-changing enterprises. His philosophy wasn't just about making beautiful objects. It was about respecting users enough to do the hard work of simplification on their behalf, so they didn't have to. And in doing so, he didn't just change product design. He changed what people expected technology could and should be. Principle 4. Perfectionism is not optional. Be a yardstick of quality. Some people aren't used to an environment where excellence is expected. Jobs was famously demanding, often to the point of being considered cruel. Stories of his explosive temper, his public humiliations of employees, and his impossibly high standards have become legendary in Silicon Valley. But to dismiss his perfectionism as mere ego or tyranny would be to completely miss the deeper philosophy at work. Jobs' relentless pursuit of perfection wasn't about personal gratification. It was about respect for the user and integrity in craftsmanship. He believed that if something was going to exist in the world, if it was going to carry the Apple name and occupy space in people's lives, it had to be extraordinary. This philosophy revealed itself in ways both visible and invisible. During the development of the original Macintosh in the early 1980s, Jobs reviewed every aspect of the computer, including the internal circuit board, the electronic brain hidden inside the case that no consumer would ever see. When one of the engineers protested that spending time perfecting something invisible was wasteful, Jobs delivered a response that perfectly captured his philosophy. When you're a carpenter making a beautiful chest of drawers, you're not going to use a piece of plywood on the back, even though it faces the wall and nobody will ever see it. You'll know it's there, so you're going to use a beautiful piece of wood. Jobs insisted that the circuit board be redesigned to be more elegant and symmetrical. This decision required extra time, resources, and effort from engineers who thought their work was already complete. But for Jobs, it wasn't negotiable. A craftsman, he believed, maintains standards not for the audience but for the craft itself. The integrity of the work matters, regardless of whether anyone notices. This wasn't wasteful perfectionism, it was integrity in action. This attention to invisible details permeated everything Jobs created. When designing the Apple II computer in the late 1970s, he was presented with 2,000 shades of beige from which to choose the color of the casing. Not one was good enough. Jobs insisted on creating his own custom shade of beige, the perfect tone that matched his vision precisely. Most CEOs would have picked one of the existing options and moved on. Jobs couldn't accept good enough when perfect was still possible. The stories of his obsessive attention to detail are almost comical in their extremity. Jobs spent 30 minutes in meetings debating the exact shade of gray for bathroom signs in Apple stores. He insisted that the floors in Apple stores had to be sourced from a specific quarry outside Florence, Italy. When designing his private Gulfstream jet, he spent over a year on the interior because he couldn't tolerate toggle buttons or stainless steel finishes. Everything had to be brushed metal buttons that aligned with his aesthetic vision. Even on his deathbed, Jobs' perfectionism didn't waver. When he needed an oxygen mask in the hospital, he hated the design of the first one. He demanded that 5 different oxygen masks be brought to him so he could choose the one with the best design. In that moment of profound vulnerability, facing mortality itself, Jobs still cared about design and quality. This wasn't vanity. It was a value system so deeply embedded that it couldn't be separated from who he was. But where Jobs' perfectionism truly mattered was in the products that reached millions of users. During development of the original Macintosh, Jobs became obsessed with the title bars at the top of Windows on the screen. He forced the developers through approximately 20 iterations, insisting on one tiny tweak after another. When the developers protested that they had more important things to work on, Jobs shouted, "Can you imagine looking at that every day? It's not just a little thing. It's something we have to do right." This exchange reveals the core of Jobs' philosophy. Users would look at those title bars thousands of times. Every day, for years, people would interact with this interface element. If it wasn't perfect, that imperfection would compound into a significant degradation of the user experience. Jobs understood that excellence in products comes from excellence in countless small details that most people would never consciously notice but would subconsciously feel. Jobs insisted that the Macintosh graphics package be able to draw rectangles with rounded corners, something no other computer could do at the time. When an engineer protested that it wasn't necessary, Jobs literally dragged him out of the Apple office and took him on a walk through their neighborhood, pointing out 17 examples of rounded rectangles within 3 blocks: street signs, architectural details, window frames. Rounded rectangles are everywhere. Jobs insisted. He understood something the engineer didn't. These shapes existed in the physical world because they felt natural and pleasing to humans. If computers were going to be tools for people, they needed to reflect the visual language people already understood. When developing the iPod in 2001, Jobs made a decision just 6 weeks before the scheduled launch that sent shockwaves through the company. The plastic screen had to be replaced with glass. Jobs had become convinced that plastic would scratch too easily and compromise the user experience over time. Designers, engineers, and technicians were sent scrambling to completely redesign the casing. The decision added significant cost and complexity to the manufacturing process. But Jobs didn't care about the added expense or how the media might react to a potential delay. His primary focus was on releasing the most perfect product possible. Detail. Jobs understood that every touchpoint with a product shapes the user's experience and relationship with it. The startup sound was an opportunity to create a moment of delight, or at minimum, to avoid creating a moment of annoyance. This insistence on perfection extended to parts of products that users would never see but which affected quality. Jobs demanded the highest quality screws be used on internal components. He insisted on beautiful finishes on parts hidden inside the case. When questioned about these seemingly wasteful choices, his response was always the same: a true craftsman cares about quality throughout, not just in the visible parts. Cal Newport, analyzing Jobs' approach, identified something profound in this perfectionism. When we declare something to be good enough, we are declaring that we have reached the limits of our comfort zone. A good enough outcome in this respect is a snapshot of our current ability level. Pushing something beyond this point crosses a threshold into an ambiguous and uncomfortable territory, where we need skills we don't yet have and which might be difficult to acquire and apply. In other words, Jobs' perfectionism was a form of practice, a way of continually pushing himself and his team beyond their current capabilities into new territories of skill and understanding. Jobs' quest for perfection made him complicated and exhausting, Newport notes, but it also made him and his team really good at what they did. Jonathan Ive, Apple's chief design officer and Jobs' close collaborator, explained their shared philosophy. Why do we assume that simple is good? Because with physical products, we have to feel we can dominate them. As you bring order to complexity, you find a way to make the product defer to you. Simplicity isn't just a visual style. It's not just minimalism or the absence of clutter. It involves digging through the depth of complexity. This digging through complexity, this refusal to accept surface-level solutions, required the kind of perfectionism Jobs embodied. Jobs articulated his design philosophy clearly. In most people's vocabularies, design means veneer. But to me, nothing could be further from the meaning of design. Design is the fundamental soul of a man-made creation that ends up expressing itself in successive outer layers. Design wasn't decoration applied at the end, it was the essence of the product, which had to be perfect from the inside out. This philosophy created a culture at Apple where mediocrity wasn't tolerated. Jobs would famously divide people into heroes and dunces. If your work was exceptional, he'd praise it effusively. If it fell short, he'd let you know in brutally honest terms. Former colleagues described him as a tough customer, very demanding, with a passion for perfection. Yet many also described the experience of working with him as transformative, being pushed to produce work they didn't know they were capable of. One colleague recalled, "He was rather wonderful. He didn't allow other people to have second-rate standards." This captures the paradox of Jobs' perfectionism. It was simultaneously exhausting and elevating. He refused to let people settle for less than their best, even when they wanted to. Jobs' philosophy of perfectionism was ultimately about respect. Respect for the craft, respect for the user, and respect for the impact products have on people's lives. He understood something that many creators miss. When we put something into the world that's merely adequate, we're essentially telling users that they're not worth the extra effort to make it great. Conversely, when we insist on excellence in every detail, we're communicating that the people who use our products deserve the very best we're capable of creating. As Jobs himself explained, there's a tremendous amount of craftsmanship between a great idea and a great product, and it's that process that is the magic. The idea is just the beginning. The real work, the backbreaking, detail-obsessed, perfectionist work of turning that idea into something truly excellent, that's where the magic happens. Jobs' philosophy of perfectionism teaches us that excellence isn't about having talent or resources. It's about having standards and refusing to compromise them, even when it's difficult, even when others think those standards are excessive. It's about being, as Jobs said, a yardstick of quality that challenges everyone around you to raise their own standards. Because when excellence becomes the expectation rather than the exception, extraordinary things become possible. Principle 5. Think different. Innovation distinguishes between a leader and a follower. Jobs didn't believe in market research or focus groups. He believed in intuition and vision. His famous invocation of Henry Ford applies here. "If I'd asked customers what they wanted, they would have told me a faster horse." Jobs understood that true innovation means showing people what they didn't know they wanted, needs they couldn't articulate because they couldn't imagine solutions that didn't yet exist. This philosophy wasn't arrogance. It was a profound understanding of the limitations of conventional market research. When Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, one of his first acts was launching the Think Different campaign, which would become one of the most iconic advertising campaigns in history. The campaign featured black and white images of revolutionary figures: Albert Einstein, Martin Luther King Jr., Pablo Picasso, Amelia Earhart, Gandhi, and others, people who had fundamentally changed their fields by refusing to accept the status quo. The campaign's manifesto, voiced by Jobs himself in some versions, captured his philosophy perfectly. "Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes. The ones who see things differently, they're not fond of rules and they have no respect for the status quo. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do." This wasn't just marketing copy. It was Jobs' genuine worldview. He believed that innovation didn't come from following the crowd or asking permission. It came from having the courage to pursue your vision even when, especially when, others thought you were crazy. As Jobs told his team when explaining the campaign, Think Different celebrates the soul of the Apple brand, that creative people with passion can change the world for the better. The philosophy of thinking different manifested most dramatically in Jobs' approach to product development. At a 1982 planning retreat for the Macintosh team, someone suggested they should do market research to see what customers wanted. Jobs' response was immediate and unequivocal: "No, because customers don't know what they want until we've shown them." When a reporter from Popular Science asked what type of market research he'd done before unveiling the Macintosh, Jobs scoffed. Did Alexander Graham Bell do any market research before he invented the phone? This wasn't dismissiveness toward customers. Jobs was deeply passionate about creating products that would delight users. But he understood something crucial. Customers can tell you what problems they're experiencing with existing solutions, but they can't envision entirely new paradigms. As Theodore Levitt famously observed, people don't want a quarter-inch drill, they want a quarter-inch hole. Customers can articulate their underlying needs: transportation, communication, entertainment, but they can't necessarily imagine revolutionary new ways to fulfill those needs. The iMac, launched in 1998, perfectly exemplified this philosophy. At the time, personal computers were beige boxes, utilitarian, boring, indistinguishable from one another. If Apple had conducted focus groups asking people what they wanted in a computer, no one would have suggested a translucent, candy-colored machine that looked more like a piece of modern art than office equipment. But Jobs and designer Johnny Ive saw an opportunity to make technology approachable and even joyful. The iMac was revolutionary not just for its aesthetics but for its radical simplicity. It eliminated floppy drives and embraced USB ports when both decisions seemed crazy to the industry. Critics predicted disaster. How could Apple succeed by giving customers something they didn't ask for? But Jobs understood that people didn't want beige boxes. They just didn't know there was an alternative. Within 5 months of launch, the iMac became the best-selling personal computer in America, helping pull Apple back from the brink of bankruptcy. The iPod represented another triumph of visionary thinking over conventional research. In 2001, the market already had numerous MP3 players. If Jobs had asked customers what they wanted, they likely would have requested something similar to existing options but with minor improvements. Instead, Jobs and his team reimagined the entire experience of portable music. The iPod's click-wheel interface, the seamless integration with iTunes, the 1,000 songs in your pocket positioning, none of these emerged from customer surveys. They emerged from Jobs' vision of what the experience should be. When Jobs introduced the iPhone in 2007, he was again betting against conventional wisdom. The smartphone market was dominated by BlackBerry and Nokia. These companies had conducted extensive research showing that business users wanted physical keyboards for efficient email. If Jobs had followed that research, the iPhone would have had a keyboard. Instead, he eliminated the keyboard entirely, replacing it with a revolutionary touchscreen interface that dynamically adapted to whatever app you were using. Industry experts were skeptical. Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer famously laughed at the iPhone's $499 price point and lack of a keyboard. But Jobs understood something the research didn't reveal. People would gladly trade the familiarity of physical keyboards for the flexibility and elegance of a touchscreen. They just needed to experience it first. The iPhone went on to fundamentally transform not just the phone industry but human behavior itself, creating the smartphone era and changing how billions of people interact with information, each other, and the world. Jobs' philosophy of thinking different also manifested in his approach to business strategy. When he returned to Apple in 1997, conventional wisdom said the company should compete directly with Microsoft, offering similar products at similar prices through similar channels. Jobs rejected this entirely. He ended Apple's war with Microsoft, declaring, "We have to let go of this notion that for Apple to win, Microsoft has to lose." Instead of competing on Microsoft's terms, Jobs repositioned Apple as something fundamentally different. Not just a technology company but a lifestyle brand for creative people who value design and simplicity. This strategic differentiation required courage. Jobs knew that you always had to be a little different to buy an Apple computer. By positioning Apple as a brand for nonconformists and innovators, he was deliberately limiting his potential customer base. But he understood that trying to appeal to everyone means appealing to no one. Better to dominate a smaller segment that genuinely resonated with your values than to chase mass-market acceptance by diluting your vision. The philosophy of innovation as the key differentiator between leaders and followers became one of Jobs' most frequently cited principles. Innovation distinguishes between a leader and a follower, he declared. This wasn't just about creating new products. It was about fostering a culture where innovation was expected, celebrated, and protected from the forces that crush it in most organizations. Jobs understood that innovation requires more than just creative individuals. It requires creating an environment where those individuals can thrive. He famously said, "Innovation has nothing to do with how many R&D dollars you have." When Apple came up with the Mac, IBM was spending at least 100 times more on R&D. It's not about money. It's about the people you have, how you're led, and how much you get it. Innovation was a cultural mindset, not a budget line item. This meant building psychological safety for people to take risks and make mistakes in service of discovery. It meant protecting visionary projects from the bean counters who would kill them for not fitting into neat ROI calculations. It meant having the courage to pursue ideas that seemed impractical or unprofitable in the short term, but could be revolutionary in the long term. However, Jobs' philosophy wasn't simply ignore all customer input. That's a common misinterpretation that has led many entrepreneurs astray. Jobs was intensely focused on customer experience. He just understood the difference between asking customers, "What do you want?" versus deeply understanding their underlying needs and pain points. As one analysis notes, really great products come from melding two points of view, the technology point of view and the customer point of view. You need both. Jobs could recognize a need, the input part, then follow his heart and intuition to develop products to meet that need. When customers said they wanted faster horses, Jobs heard them saying they wanted faster, more efficient transportation. The solution wasn't a literal faster horse, it was reimagining transportation entirely. This required digging beneath surface-level requests to understand the fundamental job customers were trying to accomplish. The iMac, launched in 1998, perfectly exemplified this philosophy. At the time, personal computers were beige boxes, utilitarian, boring, indistinguishable from one another. If Apple had conducted focus groups asking people what they wanted in a computer, no one would have suggested a translucent, candy-colored machine that looked more like a piece of modern art than office equipment. But Jobs and designer Johnny Ive saw an opportunity to make technology approachable and even joyful. The iMac was revolutionary not just for its aesthetics but for its radical simplicity. It eliminated floppy drives and embraced USB ports when both decisions seemed crazy to the industry. Critics predicted disaster. How could Apple succeed by giving customers something they didn't ask for? But Jobs understood that people didn't want beige boxes. They just didn't know there was an alternative. Within 5 months of launch, the iMac became the best-selling personal computer in America, helping pull Apple back from the brink of bankruptcy. The iPod represented another triumph of visionary thinking over conventional research. In 2001, the market already had numerous MP3 players. If Jobs had asked customers what they wanted, they likely would have requested something similar to existing options but with minor improvements. Instead, Jobs and his team reimagined the entire experience of portable music. The iPod's click-wheel interface, the seamless integration with iTunes, the 1,000 songs in your pocket positioning, none of these emerged from customer surveys. They emerged from Jobs' vision of what the experience should be. When Jobs introduced the iPhone in 2007, he was again betting against conventional wisdom. The smartphone market was dominated by BlackBerry and Nokia. These companies had conducted extensive research showing that business users wanted physical keyboards for efficient email. If Jobs had followed that research, the iPhone would have had a keyboard. Instead, he eliminated the keyboard entirely, replacing it with a revolutionary touchscreen interface that dynamically adapted to whatever app you were using. Industry experts were skeptical. Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer famously laughed at the iPhone's $499 price point and lack of a keyboard. But Jobs understood something the research didn't reveal. People would gladly trade the familiarity of physical keyboards for the flexibility and elegance of a touchscreen. They just needed to experience it first. The iPhone went on to fundamentally transform not just the phone industry but human behavior itself, creating the smartphone era and changing how billions of people interact with information, each other, and the world. The essence of Jobs' Think Different philosophy was captured in his belief that our task is to read things that are not yet on the page. This poetic description reveals the heart of visionary innovation, seeing possibilities that don't yet exist, connecting dots that others can't see, and having the courage to pursue those possibilities even when they can't be validated by conventional research or proven by existing data. This approach requires a rare combination of attributes: deep empathy for users, intimate understanding of technology, courage to pursue unconventional paths, and the ability to inspire teams to execute a vision they can barely articulate. It means being comfortable with ambiguity, willing to trust intuition when data is insufficient, and having the conviction to push forward when everyone else thinks the idea is crazy. Jobs proved that the most transformative innovations don't come from asking people what they want and giving it to them. They come from understanding people so deeply that you can show them possibilities they couldn't have imagined on their own. The original iMac, the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, none emerged from customer surveys. They emerged from Jobs' ability to see around corners and imagine possibilities that didn't yet exist but would fundamentally reshape how humans interact with technology. This is what it means to think different. Having the courage to trust your vision over market validation, the wisdom to understand user needs better than users can articulate them, and the conviction to pursue revolutionary ideas even when conventional wisdom says they'll fail. As Jobs understood, followers optimize existing paradigms. Leaders create entirely new ones. This strategic differentiation required courage. Jobs knew that you always had to be a little different to buy an Apple computer. By positioning Apple as a brand for nonconformists and innovators, He was deliberately limiting his potential customer base. But he understood that trying to appeal to everyone means appealing to no one. Better to dominate a smaller segment that genuinely resonated with your values than to chase mass market acceptance by diluting your vision. The philosophy of innovation as the key differentiator between leaders and followers became one of Jobs' most frequently cited principles. Innovation distinguishes between a leader and a follower, he declared. This wasn't just about creating new products. It was about fostering a culture where innovation was expected, celebrated, and protected from the forces that crush it in most organizations. Jobs understood that innovation requires more than just creative individuals. It requires creating an environment where those individuals can thrive. He famously said, "Innovation has nothing to do with how many R&D dollars you have." When Apple came up with the Mac, IBM was spending at least 100 times more on R&D. It's not about money. It's about the people you have, how you're led, and how much you get it. Innovation was a cultural mindset, not a budget line item. This meant building psychological safety for people to take risks and make mistakes in service of discovery. It meant protecting visionary projects from the bean counters who would kill them for not fitting into neat ROI calculations. It meant having the courage to pursue ideas that seemed impractical or unprofitable in the short term, but could be revolutionary in the long term. However, Jobs' philosophy wasn't simply ignore all customer input. That's a common misinterpretation that has led many entrepreneurs astray. Jobs was intensely focused on customer experience. He just understood the difference between asking customers, "What do you want?" versus deeply understanding their underlying needs and pain points. As one analysis notes, really great products come from melding two points of view, the technology point of view and the customer point of view. You need both. Jobs could recognize a need, the input part, then follow his heart and intuition to develop products to meet that need. When customers said they wanted faster horses, Jobs heard them saying they wanted faster, more efficient transportation. The solution wasn't a literal faster horse, it was reimagining transportation entirely. This required digging beneath surface-level requests to understand the fundamental job customers were trying to accomplish. The iMac, launched in 1998, perfectly exemplified this philosophy. At the time, personal computers were beige boxes, utilitarian, boring, indistinguishable from one another. If Apple had conducted focus groups asking people what they wanted in a computer, no one would have suggested a translucent, candy-colored machine that looked more like a piece of modern art than office equipment. But Jobs and designer Johnny Ive saw an opportunity to make technology approachable and even joyful. The iMac was revolutionary not just for its aesthetics but for its radical simplicity. It eliminated floppy drives and embraced USB ports when both decisions seemed crazy to the industry. Critics predicted disaster. How could Apple succeed by giving customers something they didn't ask for? But Jobs understood that people didn't want beige boxes. They just didn't know there was an alternative. Within 5 months of launch, the iMac became the best-selling personal computer in America, helping pull Apple back from the brink of bankruptcy. The iPod represented another triumph of visionary thinking over conventional research. In 2001, the market already had numerous MP3 players. If Jobs had asked customers what they wanted, they likely would have requested something similar to existing options but with minor improvements. Instead, Jobs and his team reimagined the entire experience of portable music. The iPod's click-wheel interface, the seamless integration with iTunes, the 1,000 songs in your pocket positioning, none of these emerged from customer surveys. They emerged from Jobs' vision of what the experience should be. When Jobs introduced the iPhone in 2007, he was again betting against conventional wisdom. The smartphone market was dominated by BlackBerry and Nokia. These companies had conducted extensive research showing that business users wanted physical keyboards for efficient email. If Jobs had followed that research, the iPhone would have had a keyboard. Instead, he eliminated the keyboard entirely, replacing it with a revolutionary touchscreen interface that dynamically adapted to whatever app you were using. Industry experts were skeptical. Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer famously laughed at the iPhone's $499 price point and lack of a keyboard. But Jobs understood something the research didn't reveal. People would gladly trade the familiarity of physical keyboards for the flexibility and elegance of a touchscreen. They just needed to experience it first. The iPhone went on to fundamentally transform not just the phone industry but human behavior itself, creating the smartphone era and changing how billions of people interact with information, each other, and the world. Principle 6. Embrace failure as learning. Sometimes life hits you in the head with a brick. Don't lose faith. Being fired from Apple was devastating, but Jobs later called it liberating. In 1985, at just 30 years old, Steve Jobs was forced out of the company he had co-founded in a garage just 9 years earlier. The man who had revolutionized personal computing, who had built a company worth $2 billion with over 4,000 employees, found himself publicly humiliated, fired from his own creation. By any conventional measure, this was catastrophic failure. And Jobs felt every ounce of that weight. The circumstances leading to his ouster were complex and painful. Jobs had recruited John Sculley, the CEO of PepsiCo, to lead Apple with his famous pitch, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or do you want to come with me and change the world?" But the relationship soured when the Lisa computer and the original Macintosh failed to meet ambitious sales projections. Jobs' demanding management style, his perfectionism, his intensity, his refusal to accept anything less than extraordinary, had created tensions throughout the organization. When Jobs took his grievances to Apple's board of directors, expecting their support, he was shocked to discover they sided with Sculley. In May 1985, Jobs was stripped of his role leading the Macintosh division, the product that was his baby, his vision made tangible. 5 months later, realizing he had no meaningful role left at the company, Jobs resigned. An early Apple board member later explained the decision bluntly. Back then he was uncontrollable. Jobs described this period as utterly devastating. "I was a very public failure, and I even thought about running away from the valley," he admitted in his famous 2005 Stanford commencement address. He had lost everything he'd spent his adult life building. The focus of his entire professional identity was gone. The media covered his fall with glee, and Silicon Valley whispered about his downfall. But then something remarkable happened. Jobs began to realize that being fired, as painful as it was, had given him an unexpected gift: freedom. "I didn't see it then, but it turned out that getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me," Jobs would later reflect. The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again, less sure about everything. "It freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life." This reframing of failure as liberation reveals the essence of Jobs' philosophy. When he led Apple, he carried the weight of expectations, from investors, from employees, from the media, from customers. Every decision was scrutinized. Every product had to meet impossibly high standards. Success had become a burden that constrained his thinking and limited his willingness to take risks. Being fired stripped all that away. Suddenly, he had nothing to lose. He wasn't the successful CEO who had to protect his reputation. He was just a guy with ideas and passion, starting over from scratch. The lightness of being a beginner again meant he could experiment without fear, pursue radical ideas without committee approval, and focus purely on creating something extraordinary rather than managing stakeholder expectations. During his 12-year exile from Apple, Jobs founded 2 companies that would profoundly impact technology and culture: Next and Pixar. Neither journey was easy. Both tested his resilience and forced him to grow in ways that his early success at Apple never had. Next, founded in 1985, was Jobs' attempt to create the next generation of computers for higher education and business markets. He poured his vision into building machines that were technologically advanced and beautifully designed. But Next struggled commercially. The computers were too expensive, and the market wasn't ready for Jobs' vision. By conventional metrics, Next was a failure. The company never achieved significant market share or profitability on its own. But Jobs recognized the importance of learning from mistakes. The technologies developed at Next, particularly its object-oriented operating system and development tools, were years ahead of their time. When Apple acquired Next in 1997 for $429 million, bringing Jobs back to the company he'd founded, Next's technology became the foundation for OS X and iOS, the operating systems that would power Apple's resurgence. What looked like failure in the short term laid the groundwork for future success. Pixar's story followed a similar arc. Jobs acquired the computer graphics division from Lucasfilm in 1986 for $10 million. The company initially focused on selling high-end graphics computers and software, but struggled to find a viable business model. Jobs kept Pixar alive by pouring in over $50 million of his own money, bringing him close to bankruptcy multiple times. Friends and colleagues questioned whether he was throwing good money after bad. But Jobs saw potential others couldn't see. He encouraged Pixar to focus on creating animated feature films, a radical bet on unproven technology and untested talent. In 1995, Toy Story became the first fully computer-animated feature film and a massive commercial and critical success. Pixar went on to revolutionize animation and storytelling, producing hit after hit: Finding Nemo, The Incredibles, Wall-E, Up. When Disney acquired Pixar in 2006 for $7.4 billion, Jobs became Disney's largest individual shareholder. The investment that had nearly bankrupted him became one of the most successful business ventures in entertainment history. Jobs' philosophy about failure came into clearest focus in his Stanford address. "Sometimes life's going to hit you in the head with a brick. Don't lose faith," he told graduates. This wasn't empty motivational speak. It was hard-won wisdom from someone who had experienced that brick firsthand. He continued, "I'm convinced that the only thing that kept me going was that I loved what I did." This reveals a crucial insight: failure only becomes permanent when we allow it to end the story. Jobs could have walked away from technology after being fired from Apple. Many people would have, wounded by the public humiliation. But his love for the work itself, not the title, not the recognition, not even the company, sustained him through the darkest period of his professional life. Jobs recognized something profound about the relationship between failure and innovation. People say you learn more from failures than you do from successes, and that's probably true, he acknowledged. Creating something genuinely new requires venturing into uncharted territory where failure isn't just possible, it's inevitable. If getting everything right was guaranteed, it wouldn't be innovation, it would be optimization of existing solutions. This philosophy allowed Jobs to take enormous risks when he returned to Apple. He bet the company's future on products that conventional wisdom said would fail: the iMac with no floppy drive, the iPod when dozens of MP3 players already existed, the iPhone with no physical keyboard. Each of these decisions faced fierce skepticism. But Jobs had learned that failure isn't the opposite of success, it's a prerequisite for breakthrough success. The culture Jobs created at Apple reflected this philosophy. He didn't punish people for taking intelligent risks that didn't work out. He punished people for not taking risks, for accepting mediocrity, for failing to push boundaries. As one analysis notes, Jobs recognized that failing came with the territory of genuine innovation and didn't feel the need to dwell on every instance. With every new attempt, the product became better. What initially seemed like a setback ultimately contributed to enhancing the product. There's an important nuance here that separates Jobs' philosophy from reckless risk-taking. Jobs wasn't celebrating failure for its own sake or advocating that people fail deliberately. He understood that failure only happens when the process ends, when you give up. As long as you keep iterating, keep learning, keep pushing forward, what looks like failure is actually just a waypoint on the journey toward success. This perspective transforms how we experience setbacks. Jobs acknowledged that he found it the most difficult thing in the world to acknowledge he had made a mistake. His perfectionism made admitting failure painful. Yet he didn't avoid admitting mistakes when necessary, because he understood that innovation was impossible without accepting the possibility of being wrong. When Apple made mistakes during Jobs' second tenure, and there were plenty, from the Power Mac G4 Cube to MobileMe to early antenna issues with the iPhone 4, Jobs didn't try to hide them or spin them as successes. He acknowledged problems, learned from them, and moved forward. This willingness to confront failure honestly, rather than defensively, became a cultural strength that allowed Apple to iterate faster and more effectively than competitors who couldn't admit when they were wrong. Jobs' personal life during his exile from Apple also taught him invaluable lessons. He met his wife, Laurene Powell, at Stanford Business School in 1989. They married in 1991 and had 3 children together. He also had a daughter, Lisa, from a previous relationship. This period of personal growth and family building grounded him in ways that his early work-obsessed years never had. When he returned to Apple, he was still demanding and intense, but he had developed wisdom, patience, and perspective that his younger self lacked. The ultimate vindication of Jobs' philosophy came with his return to Apple. The company that had fired him was now desperate, losing over $1 billion annually and on the brink of bankruptcy. Apple acquired NeXT primarily to get its technology, but the deal brought Jobs back as an advisor. Within months, he was named interim CEO, and soon after, permanent CEO. Jobs then led one of the most remarkable corporate turnarounds in business history. The skills he developed during his wilderness years, the strategic thinking honed at NeXT, the storytelling and design sensibilities refined at Pixar, the resilience forged through repeated failures, all came together. He streamlined Apple's product line, launched the iMac, created the iPod and iTunes, introduced the iPhone and iPad, and built Apple into the most valuable company on earth. None of this would have been possible if Jobs had interpreted being fired as a final verdict on his worth or abilities. Instead, he embraced what he called the lightness of being a beginner, using his failure as a catalyst for growth rather than a reason to quit. His philosophy teaches that failure is not a destination, it's education, preparation, and refinement for what comes next. As Jobs concluded in his Stanford address, sometimes life hits you in the head with a brick. Don't lose faith. I'm convinced that the only thing that kept me going was that I loved what I did. Principle 7. Focus on what matters. People think focus means saying yes to the thing you've got to focus on. But that's not what it means at all. It means saying no to the 100 other good ideas. Jobs was as proud of what Apple didn't do as what it did. This wasn't false modesty or clever rhetoric. It was a fundamental philosophy about how excellence is achieved in a world drowning in possibilities. In an age of endless options and infinite potential directions, the courage to say no became Jobs' superpower. As he famously declared, "I'm actually as proud of the things we haven't done as the things I have done." Innovation is saying no to 1,000 things. When Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, the company wasn't just struggling financially, it was drowning in complexity. Apple had dozens of product lines, each with multiple variations and configurations. There were 15 different desktop models alone, countless peripherals, printers, PDAs, and consumer devices that nobody could make sense of. The product roadmap was a labyrinth even Apple's own executives couldn't navigate. Jobs gathered his top managers for a product review session, hoping to understand what Apple was building and why. After weeks of presentations where team members tried to explain the rationale behind each product, Jobs became increasingly frustrated. The explanations didn't make sense. The distinctions between products were arbitrary. When he finally asked the simple question, "Which products do I tell my friends to buy?" nobody could give him a clear answer. Jobs realized the fundamental problem: Apple had no focus. The company was trying to be everything to everyone, spreading its limited resources across too many initiatives, and as a result, doing nothing exceptionally well. At one particularly frustrating meeting, Jobs interrupted the presentation, went to a whiteboard, and drew a simple 2x2 matrix. Across the top, he wrote consumer and professional. Down the side, he wrote desktop and portable. "This is what we need," Jobs announced. 4 products. 1 desktop and 1 laptop for consumers. 1 desktop and 1 laptop for professionals. Everything else would be eliminated. The team was stunned. How could a technology company survive with just 4 products? Wouldn't this be commercial death? But Jobs understood something profound about focus that most leaders miss. As he would later explain at the 1997 Worldwide Developers Conference, people think focus means saying yes to the thing you've got to focus on. But that's not what it means at all. It means saying no to the 100 other good ideas that there are. You have to pick carefully. Focus wasn't about working harder on more things. It was about dramatically reducing the number of things to work on so that the remaining few could receive extraordinary attention. Jobs proceeded to cut 70% of Apple's product line. He eliminated the Newton PDA, multiple Mac models, printers, and countless accessories. He killed projects that teams had spent months or years developing. Good engineers working on decent products were reassigned or let go. It was brutal, painful, and according to conventional wisdom, reckless. But the results were spectacular. The streamlined product line meant Apple could put its best people, it's a team, on every single product. Development cycles that previously took 18 months could now be completed in 9. Resources that had been spread thin across dozens of mediocre offerings could now be concentrated on making 4 extraordinary products. Within a year, Apple went from losing over $1 billion to posting a $309 million profit. This wasn't just about product strategy, it was about creating a culture of disciplined focus. Jobs recognized what Jim Collins would later articulate in Good to Great: greatness is not a function of circumstance. Greatness, it turns out, is largely a matter of conscious choice and discipline. The discipline to say no, even to good ideas, especially to good ideas, became the foundation of Apple's renaissance. Jobs' philosophy of focus extended far beyond product lines. He applied it to every aspect of Apple's operations. When designing the first iPhone, The team explored hundreds of features and capabilities. Each addition seemed reasonable in isolation. Wouldn't users want this capability? Wouldn't that feature make the product more competitive? But Jobs ruthlessly eliminated anything that didn't serve the core vision of a simple, elegant device that anyone could use intuitively. Johnny Ive, Apple's chief design officer and Jobs' spiritual partner, explained what he learned about focus from Jobs. Truly focus. Say no to something that you think is a phenomenal idea. I've elaborated, the thing with focus is, it's not this thing you aspire to, or you decide on Monday, I'm going to be focused. It is every minute. Why are we talking about this? This is what we're working on. You can achieve so much when you truly focus. Jobs would challenge Ive with a pointed question: how many things have you said no to? I've admitted that initially, he would offer sacrificial examples, things he wasn't interested in anyway, so declining them required no real sacrifice. But Jobs saw through this. True focus, he insisted, meant saying no to things that genuinely tempted you, ideas that seemed brilliant but would dilute your primary mission. This philosophy wasn't just about products, it was about life strategy. Jobs understood that time, energy, and attention are finite resources. Every yes to one thing is automatically a no to countless other things. Most people fail to achieve greatness not because they lack talent or opportunities, but because they fail to choose. They keep all options open, dabble in multiple directions, and consequently make meaningful progress in none. Jobs articulated this clearly: we're always thinking about new markets we could enter, but it's only by saying no that you can concentrate on the things that are really important. Apple regularly considered expanding into televisions, cars, search engines, social networks, and countless other markets where they could potentially compete. But Jobs said no to nearly all of them, recognizing that entering new markets would dilute Apple's focus on perfecting the markets they'd already chosen. The 30-70 rule Jobs employed at Apple reveals his strategic thinking. When reviewing Apple's future roadmap, he identified that only 30% of projects were truly outstanding, while 70% were merely pretty good or unnecessary. Instead of trying to improve the 70%, Jobs eliminated them entirely, redirecting all resources to the exceptional 30%. This counterintuitive move, doing fewer things rather than fixing mediocre things, became a cornerstone of Apple's strategy. Jobs believed that this discipline separated leaders from followers. As he famously stated, deciding what not to do is as important as deciding what to do. This wasn't just management advice, it was a philosophical stance on how to achieve excellence in any domain. The companies and individuals who succeed aren't those who do the most things. They're the ones who do the right things with unwavering commitment. The power of this approach became evident in Apple's subsequent product launches. The iMac, released in 1998 as one of Jobs' 4 core products, became the best-selling personal computer in America within 5 months. The iPod, introduced in 2001, transformed the music industry. The iPhone, launched in 2007, revolutionized computing and communications. Each product received the full force of Apple's creative and engineering talent precisely because Jobs had the discipline to say no to dozens of other worthy projects. Jobs' approach to focus also extended to meetings and daily operations. He insisted that teams stay focused on the signal, the core work that truly mattered, and eliminate all noise. This meant ruthlessly cutting meetings that didn't serve a clear purpose, killing projects that weren't advancing the mission, and constantly asking whether each activity contributed to the strategic priorities. Kevin O'Leary, the investor and Shark Tank star, credits Jobs' focus philosophy with transforming his own business approach. He adopted Jobs' practice of identifying just 3 essential daily tasks, the signal, and eliminating everything else as noise. This consistent daily execution of what truly matters, O'Leary argues, creates exponential growth over time. The philosophy of focus as saying no runs counter to modern culture's celebration of busyness and hustle. We're conditioned to believe that doing more, working harder, and seizing every opportunity is the path to success. Jobs proved the opposite: doing less, choosing carefully, and having the courage to ignore tempting opportunities is what allows for true excellence. This discipline protected not just Apple's product quality, but also team morale and budget. When teams aren't pulled in dozens of directions, when the mission is clear and the focus is sharp, people can do their best work. Resources aren't diluted across competing priorities. Energy isn't wasted on initiatives that don't matter. The result is products where the total is much greater than the sum of the parts. Jobs' focus philosophy reveals an uncomfortable truth. Most people and organizations fail not because they don't work hard enough, but because they work hard on too many things. They say yes to every opportunity, pursue every interesting idea, and consequently make meaningful progress on nothing. Jobs proved that the opposite approach, ruthless focus achieved through discipline saying no, is the actual path to creating something extraordinary. As Jobs put it simply but powerfully, innovation is saying no to 1,000 things. This wasn't about being narrow-minded or risk-averse. It was about having the clarity to know what truly matters and the courage to protect it from dilution by everything else that merely seems important. In a world of infinite possibilities, the ability to focus, really focus, on the few things that can be truly great became Jobs' most powerful competitive advantage. Principle 8. Connect the dots. You can't connect the dots looking forward, you can only connect them looking backward. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. Jobs believed that experiences that seemed unrelated at the time would eventually connect in meaningful ways. This wasn't wishful thinking or mystical faith, it was a profound philosophical insight about how creativity, innovation, and meaningful life paths actually emerge. His calligraphy class at Reed College seemed irrelevant until it influenced Apple's revolutionary typography. His spiritual journey to India seemed like a detour until Zen philosophy shaped Apple's entire design aesthetic. This philosophy encouraged taking risks, following curiosity, and trusting that a diverse range of experiences would eventually synthesize into something unique and valuable. Jobs introduced this concept in the opening story of his famous 2005 Stanford commencement address, calling it Connecting the Dots. He began with his adoption story and decision to drop out of Reed College after just 6 months. A decision that terrified him at the time but freed him to explore subjects that genuinely interested him rather than those required for a degree. Reed College at that time offered perhaps the best calligraphy instruction in the country. Every poster, every label on every drawer across campus was beautifully hand calligraphed. Because Jobs had dropped out and didn't have to take required classes, he decided to audit a calligraphy class taught by the legendary Professor Robert Palladino, a Trappist monk who had studied under the renowned calligrapher Lloyd Reynolds. In that class, Jobs learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, about varying the amount of space between different letter combinations, about what makes great typography great. It was beautiful, historical, artistically subtle in a way that science can't capture, and I found it fascinating, Jobs recalled. But here's the crucial point: none of this had even a hope of any practical application in my life. At the time, studying calligraphy seemed utterly impractical for a college dropout with no clear career direction. There was no obvious way this knowledge would ever pay bills or lead to employment. If Jobs had been thinking strategically about his future career, he never would have taken that class. But he followed his curiosity anyway, trusting that somehow, somewhere, it would matter. 10 years later, when Apple was designing the first Macintosh computer, all of that calligraphy training came flooding back. Jobs and his team designed beautiful typography into the Mac. Multiple typefaces, proportionally spaced fonts, the attention to spacing and aesthetics that made Apple's displays feel more human and accessible than the monospaced, utilitarian text of competing computers. The Mac became the first personal computer with beautiful typography. If I had never dropped in on that single course in college, the Mac would have never had multiple typefaces or proportionally spaced fonts, Jobs explained. And since Windows just copied the Mac, it's likely that no personal computer would have them. In other words, Jobs' seemingly frivolous decision to follow his curiosity into a calligraphy classroom ultimately influenced the visual interface of virtually every computer on Earth. This is what Jobs meant by connecting the dots backward. Of course, it was impossible to connect the dots looking forward when I was in college. But it was very, very clear looking backwards 10 years later, he said. At the time, he couldn't have predicted that calligraphy would become foundational to one of the most important products in computing history. But looking backward, the connection was obvious. Jobs' spiritual journey to India provided another powerful example of seemingly disconnected experiences eventually connecting in profound ways. In 1974, at age 19, Jobs traveled to India with his Reed College friend Dan Kotke, seeking spiritual enlightenment. He spent 7 months wandering across the country, visiting ashrams, experimenting with psychedelics, and immersing himself in Hindu and Buddhist philosophy. To many observers, this looked like a detour, a young person avoiding responsibility, wasting time on aimless wandering when he should have been building a career. But as his biographer Walter Isaacson later revealed, Jobs insisted that his time in India was not a waste of time. When Jobs returned, he told friends, "The main thing I've learned is intuition, that the people in India are not just pure rational thinkers, that the great spiritual ones also have an intuition." The simplicities of Zen Buddhism, which Jobs discovered during and after his India journey, profoundly informed his design sense. The Zen principle that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication became Jobs' design mantra. The Zen emphasis on intuition over pure rationality shaped how he made decisions throughout his career. The Buddhist focus on being present and mindful influenced his legendary intensity and ability to focus completely on whatever task was before him. People began to discern the influence of Zen Buddhism in the refined minimalist design of Apple products. The clean lines, the elimination of unnecessary elements, the focus on essential functionality, all reflected Zen aesthetic principles that Jobs absorbed during his spiritual explorations. What seemed like youthful meandering turned out to be fundamental training in the philosophy that would distinguish Apple from every other technology company. Jobs articulated the deeper principle underlying these experiences in a 1995 interview with Wired. Creativity is just connecting things. When you ask creative people how they did something, they feel a little guilty because they didn't really do it, they just saw something. It seemed obvious to them after a while. That's because they were able to connect experiences they've had and synthesize new things. This insight reveals why diverse experiences matter so profoundly. The reason they were able to do that was that they've had more experiences, or they have thought more about their experiences than other people, Jobs continued. Unfortunately, that's too rare a commodity. A lot of people in our industry haven't had very diverse experiences. So they don't have enough dots to connect, and they end up with very linear solutions without a broad perspective on the problem. The broader one's understanding of the human experience, the better design we will have. This philosophy directly challenged the prevailing model of specialization and narrow focus that dominated both education and career development. While others advocated choosing a lane early and staying in it, Jobs proved that breadth of experience, technology and humanities, engineering and calligraphy, business and spirituality, created unique competitive advantages that specialization alone never could. Jobs' curiosity-driven exploration across disciplines enabled him to cultivate a uniquely valuable perspective, skill set, and network unmatched in the tech industry. He could connect the artistic sensibility of calligraphy with the technical possibilities of computing. He could apply Zen simplicity to consumer electronics. He could merge storytelling principles from Pixar with product launches at Apple. These syntheses only became possible because he had diverse dots to connect. But there's a crucial element of faith required in this approach. At Stanford, Jobs told graduates, "You have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever." This approach has never let me down, and it has made all the difference in my life. This is the uncomfortable part of connecting the dots. You can't see the pattern while you're living it. When Jobs was sleeping on friends' floors, returning Coke bottles for meal money, and taking a calligraphy class that had no obvious career application, he couldn't prove this was a wise use of his time. When he was wandering through India seeking spiritual answers, he couldn't demonstrate how this would translate into business success. He had to trust. Trust that following genuine curiosity would eventually lead somewhere valuable. Trust that diverse experiences would synthesize in unexpected ways. Trust that the investment in breadth of understanding, even when it seemed impractical, would eventually pay dividends in ways that couldn't be predicted or planned. This philosophy stands in stark contrast to the obsessive strategic planning and optimization that dominates modern career thinking. We want to know exactly where each step will lead. We want guarantees that our choices will produce specific outcomes. We want to connect the dots forward, mapping every move to predetermined goals. But as Jobs demonstrated, the most valuable connections often emerge from experiences whose significance only becomes clear in retrospect. His calligraphy class didn't make sense for a potential technology entrepreneur until it did. His spiritual journey to India didn't appear relevant to building consumer electronics until it became foundational to Apple's design philosophy. His time at Pixar learning about storytelling and animation didn't seem connected to computing until those narrative skills transformed how Apple introduced products and built emotional connections with customers. The lesson isn't to pursue experiences randomly or avoid all planning. Rather, it's to give yourself permission to follow genuine curiosity, to explore broadly even when the immediate practical application isn't obvious, and to trust that rich, diverse experiences will eventually synthesize into something uniquely valuable. Jobs' connecting the dots philosophy encourages taking risks, following passions, and building a broad base of experiences rather than optimizing narrowly for a single predetermined path. It acknowledges that the most innovative thinking comes from people who can draw on diverse domains, who have enough difference to connect patterns that others can't see. And it requires the courage to invest in experiences whose value can only be understood looking backward. The critique and counter-arguments. Of course, Steve Jobs wasn't a perfect sage. His philosophies came with a dark side that can't be ignored, a shadow that reveals the dangers of taking his principles to their extreme without the balancing forces of empathy, wisdom, and human decency. To Leonize Jobs without acknowledging these flaws would be dishonest and dangerous, creating unrealistic expectations and potentially toxic work environments for those who try to emulate him without understanding the full picture. Jobs' perfectionism, while producing revolutionary products, often crossed the line into cruelty. He was notorious for publicly humiliating employees who failed to meet his impossibly high standards. When MobileMe, Apple's email synchronization system, launched in 2008 with significant flaws, Jobs reportedly assembled the entire team responsible and subjected them to a brutal public dressing down. "Can anyone tell me what MobileMe is supposed to do?" he demanded. When they explained, he snapped, "So why the fuck doesn't it do that?" He told the team, "You've tarnished Apple's reputation. You should hate each other for having let each other down." He then replaced the head of the group on the spot, in front of everyone. This wasn't an isolated incident. Jobs was known to categorize employees as either heroes or dunces, with little middle ground. He would tell people to their faces that their work was shit, that they were fucking idiots, and that their contributions were worthless. People who worked under Jobs during certain periods described him as incredibly mean, creating an atmosphere of fear and anxiety that permeated the organization. The toxicity extended beyond Apple's Cupertino headquarters. At Foxconn, the massive Chinese manufacturing facilities where Apple products were assembled, management reportedly mimicked Jobs' abusive tactics. Managers would publicly scold employees in front of their peers, stockpiling complaints to humiliate workers during meetings. Workers who made costly mistakes were forced to read promise letters aloud to colleagues, publicly apologizing and vowing never to repeat their errors, an insulting and degrading process. The stress, anxiety, and humiliation contributed to widespread depression within the company and, tragically, a wave of worker death in 2010. Jobs' infamous reality distortion field, his ability to convince himself and others to believe almost anything through charm, charisma, bravado, and persistence, could inspire extraordinary achievements, but it could also create unrealistic expectations and toxic dynamics. Andy Hertzfeld, an original Macintosh team member, described how Jobs could distort an audience's sense of proportion and scales of difficulties, making impossible tasks seem achievable. While this sometimes pushed teams to accomplish things they didn't know they were capable of, it also led to burnout, broken promises to customers, and the dismissal of legitimate concerns from engineers who understood technical limitations. The reality distortion field became particularly problematic when it extended to appropriating others' ideas. Jonathan Ive, Apple's legendary designer and Jobs' spiritual partner, admitted that Jobs would regularly shift through his ideas, dismiss most of them as not very good, then later present the ones he liked as his own creations. Ive would sit in product launch audiences watching Jobs take full credit for designs I've had created. While I've ultimately appreciated how Jobs pushed ideas into reality, acknowledging that the ideas that come from me and my team would have been completely irrelevant, nowhere, if Steve hadn't been here, the experience of having one's creative contributions regularly appropriated was deeply frustrating. Jobs' belief in following intuition over market research, while producing revolutionary products, came from a unique position of power and resources that isn't replicable for most people. Jobs had the capital, the platform, the team, and the reputation to pursue his vision even when conventional wisdom said it would fail. Most entrepreneurs and business leaders don't have those advantages. For them, completely ignoring market research and customer feedback isn't visionary, it's reckless. As Cal Newport notes, Jobs' philosophy evolved over time from a shuttered confidence in the inventions of his own brain to entertaining a world of possibilities, listening to his team and acknowledging the nature of the world around him. The mature Jobs understood that really great products come from melding two points of view, the technology point of view and the customer point of view. You need both. Jobs' work-life balance was notoriously poor, raising questions about whether his professional success came at an unacceptable personal cost. During Apple's turnaround years, He worked from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. every single day while simultaneously leading Pixar, developing kidney stones from the stress and workload. His relationship with his first daughter, Lisa Brennan Jobs, was troubled for years. He initially denied paternity despite a DNA test showing 94.1% probability that he was her father, and he provided only minimal financial support even after Apple's IPO made him a millionaire. His son Reed clearly idolized him but struggled with his father's lack of engagement. His wife Laureen was clearly frustrated at times with his absence from family life. While Jobs later emphasized the importance of his family, telling his sister that he believed that love happened all the time everywhere and setting love for his family as a primary concern. The reality was that for much of his career, work consumed him to the detriment of personal relationships. The narrative that Jobs perfectly balanced work and family is largely mythology. The truth is messier and more human. Perhaps most importantly, Jobs' philosophy of thinking different and trusting intuition shouldn't be confused with ignoring expertise, dismissing data, or working in isolation. Jobs was successful not because he worked alone, but because he surrounded himself with brilliant people. Johnny Ive, Tim Cook, Phil Schiller, and countless engineers and designers, and created an environment where their talents could flourish. Jobs and Ive weren't just colleagues. Jobs called Ive his spiritual partner, someone who gets the big picture as well as the most infinitesimal details about each product. They thought up most products together, ate lunch regularly, and their families became close. The myth of the lone genius CEO making all decisions is dangerous and inaccurate. Jobs' genius lay partly in recognizing talent, empowering it, protecting it from organizational bureaucracy, and pushing it to achieve more than people thought possible. He gave Ive more operational power than anyone else at Apple except Jobs himself, ensuring no one could interfere with the design process. This collaborative intensity, not solitary vision, produced Apple's greatest innovations. The question isn't whether to adopt all of Jobs' philosophies wholesale. Doing so would be both impossible and unwise. His approach worked in a specific context with specific resources and came with significant costs that many people wouldn't be willing or able to pay. The real wisdom lies in understanding which elements can serve your own journey and which might need to be tempered with empathy, balance, and ethical considerations. Jobs' perfectionism can inspire excellence without requiring cruelty. His focus can eliminate distractions without eliminating people who disagree with you. His intuition can guide decisions without dismissing data entirely. His passion for work can coexist with genuine presence for family. His drive to change the world can happen through collaborative genius rather than domination. The uncomfortable truth is that Jobs succeeded not just because of his philosophies, but sometimes in spite of his worst behaviors. Many of the people he brutalized still respect what they accomplished together, but they also bear scars from the experience. The products were extraordinary, but the human cost was real and shouldn't be minimized or romanticized. Modern leadership research suggests that Jobs' abusive behaviors weren't necessary for Apple's success. They were flaws that the company succeeded despite, not because of. The notion that brilliant jerks are somehow more creative or effective has been largely debunked. Organizations with psychological safety, respect, and collaboration consistently outperform those built on fear and intimidation. We can learn from Jobs' obsession with excellence, his courage to pursue vision over convention, his discipline to focus ruthlessly on what matters, and his faith that diverse experiences will eventually connect in meaningful ways. But we should reject the cruelty, the appropriation of others' contributions, the reality distortion that dismisses legitimate concerns, and the worship of work at the expense of everything else. The legacy of Steve Jobs is complex, a mix of visionary brilliance and human flaws, world-changing innovation and personal failures, inspirational philosophy and cautionary tales. The challenge for anyone studying his life is to extract the wisdom while leaving behind the toxicity, to pursue excellence without requiring cruelty, and to understand that creating something insanely great doesn't require destroying the people around you in the process. So what can we learn from Steve Jobs' philosophy? At its core, it's about the radical belief that individual vision and passion can change the world. It's about having the courage to pursue what you love, even when others don't understand. It's about the discipline to focus on what truly matters and the wisdom to trust that your diverse experiences will eventually connect in meaningful ways. Jobs' greatest innovation wasn't the iPhone or the iPad. It was proving that technology could be both powerful and beautiful, both sophisticated and simple. He showed us that the intersection of technology and liberal arts, of engineering and humanity, is where magic happens. Whether you're building a company, creating art, or just trying to live a meaningful life, Jobs' philosophy offers a powerful framework. Do what you love, think different, embrace simplicity, and never settle for less than extraordinary. What aspects of Jobs' philosophy resonate most with you? Which of these principles could transform your approach to work and life? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the minds that shaped our world. Remember, the goal isn't to become Steve Jobs, it's to find the Steve Jobs principles that can help you become the best version of yourself.